Tolkien and Lord of the Rings are in a strange place right now where people are simultaneously trying to drag down him and his previous works, while also saying that no, you should just give Rings of Power a chance, wait for it to come out. Hell, most of them don't actually get great until season 3. Why not go the whole 5 series first before you make a decision about it? Myself and others have been calling Rings of Power or the Wheel of Time adaptations fanfiction. But part of trying to defend Rings of Power has now become that they're trying to take back the word to defend it. And that includes by calling Tolkien's works itself fanfiction. Yes, The Lord of the Rings is now fanfiction, apparently. This video is gonna be interesting. Now, the term fanfiction has a lot of deep meaning behind it, depending on which context it's used. It's like calling this a YouTube video. It's not an insult. But if you say that a major Hollywood movie looks like a YouTube video, that's an incredible insult, and that's the crux of why fanfiction is used the way it is. But the Tolkien professor sees fanfiction as something very different.
Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor here. I noticed that there's this trend towards people who are dismissive of the Rings of Power show to call it something like that Amazon fan fiction. And it's the use of that term with dismissal and scorn that particularly interested me.
Yes, and I've done this myself, because this is yet another person coming into a property that they never created and changing the fundamental aspects of it. We've seen it from the trailer themselves. They don't care about the canon or the look or the themes or how a world is supposed to feel. No, what they want to do is impose themselves on it. They want to make it for them, change it for them and their ideas. We've also seen it with Halo, where they took the Halo IP, then just made Master Chief not Master Chief, and changed all of the characters and how everything worked. It's when they don't care about the canon. This is what fanfiction became known for. People would take two characters that weren't together in the series and just start shipping them in their own stories. That's what Hollywood is doing. That's what they did in Wheel of Time, where they took characters that were never together, and suddenly, in the show, now they are. I started calling these things fanfiction because that's what they were. They weren't a genuine, authentic attempt to represent the original work.
You see, I myself might have used the word with a similar tone, maybe 10 years ago.
I can only apologize that the common peasantry hasn't kept pace with the speed of your evolution in academia over the last 10 years. For I am just a poor, uncultured swine.
As an English professor, it was part of my culture to look down on fan fiction.
And that's a perfectly reasonable and logical attitude to have, although it's not the way people are using the word.
I realized many years ago that's a really silly way to look at things. That is, fan fiction, the creative engagement with something, right? When you engage with a work of literature, you can do it in many ways, right? You can do it by reading and rereading, discussing it and talking about it, and you can do it by creatively engaging with it.
Obviously, a great original piece of literature will be better than a great piece of fan fiction. It's very reasonable to me to consider Shakespeare to be better than someone that's written a story about how they want Obi-Wan and Anakin to get together behind the bike sheds. But even if you take the best fan fiction, an original great piece of work like Lord of the Rings will always be better than a great piece of fan fiction because of the effort and the time and the originality that went into it. It's far more difficult and complicated, far more impressive to create your own universe than to just take somebody else's and write a story in it, regardless of the quality of that story. That's also not the way anyone is using the term fanfiction when they talk about Rings of Power, because there's nothing inherently bad about fanfiction. You can get some great pieces of fanfiction which take the original universe and the characters and stay loyal to them and true, but still come up with an original story. These can even be so good that the audience starts to consider them unofficial canon. But when used derogatorily, there's a whole different concept underneath it, that people are taking somebody else's universe because they couldn't create their own, and twisting it and using it for their own uses, morphing it and changing it into what they want, not attempting to be the original work at all. It's not an insult to call fanfiction fanfiction. It is an insult to call a major movie or TV fanfiction when they actually own the original IP, because it means they're not treating it like their original piece of work. They're not sticking true to that story. No, instead, they're doing nothing more than getting Frodo and Bilbo together and making them smash as often as possible. These are people which aren't treating it with the respect it deserves. The respect that an original author who created that world would have done. They're treating it like someone who doesn't have a connection to it, who doesn't really care about it, They just see it as a tool to get them out into the world. And if you're thinking, no, I talked to them in a Q&A in London and I can tell that they have respect for Tolkien, I simply point you through the trailer and everything they changed about it, changed about the world, about the fundamental aspects of the world. They clearly don't care about it as much as the fans, which are using the word fanfiction derogatorily, simply because if they did, they would have made an effort to keep the theme, the plans, the look, the aesthetics of it the same. They would have made an effort to keep the universe the same, rather than changing it, because it's got to reflect the real world. It's not supposed to be the real world. It's supposed to be Tolkien's world. It's not supposed to morph into the world that they want, and the fact that they think they can change it means that they're making nothing more than fan fiction, because they don't respect the original universe and think it must be changed to what they would have written.
And that has a really august tradition. In fact, it used to just be called literature, right?
No. Already in this, you've argued past the definitions of words and how people are intending to use them. With fan fiction, you took the broad definition of everything that fans create, when people are using it specifically to mean a specific thing. And you're doing the same with literature. You're taking literature to mean every single written piece of work, rather than the specific meaning which it's generally used. Literature, definition, written works, which is the broad definition. Then the specific definition of, especially those considered of superior or lasting artistic merit. A great work of literature. Technically, you can go to a takeaway, get their menu out, and that's a work of literature. But it's not the way anyone would use the term. Whereas Shakespeare, Tolkien, Wheel of Time, Mistborn, these are all literature. Yes, you can argue semantics of whether someone is correct by arguing the broad definition against the narrow specific definition. But it would be extremely disingenuous because you know that's not what they mean when they're using those words. And it would be an interesting attempt to try and get some more of that reflected glory of the great works of literature, to try and make fanfiction sound better than it actually is. If there is nothing wrong with the term fanfiction, then you don't need any of that reflected glory. It should be able to stand on its own 2 feet, and I think it does, just depending on the context of which it is used and intended.
Think about fan fiction, that desire to engage creatively with a work within a world that you're reading, right?
With all due respect, somebody's desire to do something, or even enthusiasm about a project, doesn't guarantee quality of that project at all. Those are great things to have if accompanied by talent, but there can be different reasons for wanting to engage with a world. For instance, in the cases of Rings of Power or Wheel of Time, having the belief that those worlds are wrong at their fundamental levels and that you can fix them by making them reflective of today's world. Passion for something, enthusiasm for something, isn't necessarily good. It depends on the intention behind that passion. And going into a world thinking you can fix it because it's wrong means that you innately don't like the piece. And that means that your passion will inevitably end up destroying the original work because you want to replace it with you, with your ideas, with your beliefs. And that is not what the original piece was. And when you come to present it to other people, you have a problem, because they will be able to see that this isn't the world that they loved originally. And that is why they start to frown upon it.
Virgil did it, Dante did it, Chaucer did it, Shakespeare did it. It was part of the core tradition of what it meant to do literature.
I never studied English literature, so I have no idea if it's true. I'm just going to assume it is, because it's not the argument anyone's using anyway. It's actually not relevant at all. No one's saying fan fiction is bad. With Rings of Power, it's used derogatorily because it was their choice. They relegated themselves to that classification because they had the IP. They could have written canon. All they had to do is stick to the lore, stick to the books, stick to the original universe and the canons and the aesthetics and the themes of it all, the morality, the philosophy of it. It's all got to be true to Tolkien's vision. And yet we saw from the trailer that it wasn't. We saw from the interviews, heard from their own mouths that it wasn't in their own interviews. They don't want to make Tolkien's world. They want to reflect the modern world. This in itself is such a fundamental building block that it can no longer be considered canon because it's not even the same universe. Therefore, it will only be fan fiction. Somebody unrelated to the piece coming in, taking the IP and changing it because they prefer their story. You can do that as a fan and it's fine. You can't do that after buying the IP, pitch it to customers as if it is a legitimate original piece of canonical work, and then not expect anyone to call you on it. Saying I have the production quality of a YouTube video isn't an insult. Saying it about the Rings of Power is.
Back to the Rings of Power, Amazon adaptation of Tolkien. Tolkien did it. And Tolkien didn't just do it. It was Tolkien's chief mode. When he was thinking about the literary works that he loved, he engaged with them creatively. When he discovered the Kalevala, the Finnish Kalevala, he wrote Kullervo. He wrote his own version. He wrote a fan fiction.
And there's nothing wrong with Tolkien doing that as a form of personal entertainment for himself. But if he took those universes and then changed them, altered the characters, changed how they spoke, how they reacted, who they were interested in, how they looked, the main philosophies and themes and principles of the work, and instead of keeping the universe how it was, decided that no, actually, he wanted it to look like Australia for some reason, and then he took that piece of fan fiction and gave it to the original author and said, this is a canonical piece of your text, the author wouldn't have been very pleased. And that's the same reaction you get from fans when they're expecting a piece of work which is meant to imitate the original author and be in the original world, and then actually you get Rings of Power and it turns out, no, this is just a twisted version of it, which is trying to present itself as something which it clearly isn't.
And of course, many elements of The Lord of the Rings are equally that same kind of creative engagement with the works that he loved. Most obviously, of course, the Rohirrim and the Anglo-Saxon texts that he loved so much.
This is an incredibly false representation of something. If anything, a better classification of those would be Easter eggs. They were parts that were inspired by something else that he loved so much he wanted to incorporate into his own work. But that's not fan fiction. The Lord of the Rings is his work. It's his creation. It's his original piece of literature. Now, there is a theory that there is no original idea at this point because humans have been on the earth for so long that everything that could have been thought has been thought of, and that's why advancement is generally done by taking somebody else's idea and iterating on it. You improve it or twist it or give it some kind of different combination with something else. Yes, having horsemen isn't an original idea. But when it's absorbed into a whole, when it becomes a holistic piece of work, that becomes an entirely new, original piece. And so he can reference whatever he wants from anything else, but it's still his work fitted into his universe. It is not fan fiction. And you see this in many other places. Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan loved Lord of the Rings, and there are lots of Lord of the Rings references in Wheel of Time. Even the main villain and having him on a mountain was inspired by Lord of the Rings. But Wheel of Time isn't Lord of the Rings. It's not Lord of the Rings fan fiction. It's an entirely different universe, an original piece of work. It's just that that author loved the other one so much, he wanted to incorporate bits of it into it. References, Easter eggs for people that knew both works. This is the same reason there are Wheel of Time references in Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones isn't Wheel of Time fanfiction either.
So, when people, I would caution people against dismissing fan fiction.
No one's dismissing fan fiction or saying fan fiction is bad. They're dismissing Rings of Power as fan fiction, which makes Rings of Power a bad piece of Tolkien literature. They're saying that if you expected people to associate Rings of Power with the Tolkien universe and Lord of the Rings, then you've failed, because you've gone in and changed it so much that it can no longer be considered an authentic piece of canon.
It's especially ironic, anyway, when you do it in relation to a Tolkien adaptation, because that whole impetus was really at the heart of what Tolkien himself did. And so, yeah, actually, sure. All adaptations are fan fiction, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes, there is. There's many things wrong with that. Once again, you're arguing from the wide definition when people mean the narrow definition. No, there's nothing wrong with fan fiction. Yes, people are using it derogatorily in the narrow definition, and that is absolutely correct, as I've spoken about earlier. But also, now you've just removed all standards from literature. Congratulations! All adaptations are fanfiction, and that's great, because fanfiction is now no longer different than an original piece of literature. Yes, absolutely. When I go off and write about Aragorn getting with Sauron and going bowling on top of a unicorn, my fanfiction is apparently just of exactly the same quality and just as much of Tolkien's work as Lord of the Rings. Why? Well, don't you know, Tolkien actually went off himself and wrote some of his own fanfiction at some point, and that means that all fanfiction written about his must not only be allowed, but must also be immediately accepted as canon and put on an equal bar as his. The argument itself is insane, but it's also one that Tolkien disagreed with himself. In a letter from Tolkien to his publisher, he complains about someone who was writing fanfiction about his work, and he admitted that I suppose since one cannot claim property in inventing proper names, there is no legal obstacle to this young ass publishing his sequel, if he could find any other publisher, either respectable or disreputable, who would accept such tripe. I think a suitable letter from Alan and Unwin might be more effective than one from me. I once had a similar proposal couched in the most obsequious terms from a young woman who I replied to in the negative. I received a most vituperative letter. This letter to his publisher is among the spiciest of Tolkien's responses to the phenomenon of fanfiction, filled with a sense of defeat, and somewhat lacking in the open approach that Lewis had to his fans. Tolkien was very specific about his language, about his world, about the world and universe he created, that he made his life's work. And who can blame him? Nothing stops anyone taking somebody else's characters and just writing a story about it. If you enjoy that, that's fine. If you enjoy publishing that and people enjoy reading it, that's fine. But it's not going to be part of the original universe unless it's exceptional, and for some reason all of the fans get together and consider it so. We've seen this happen before in some expanded universe books, or there are fan movies on YouTube which are so incredible, I think many people, if not most people, would be happy considering them canon. You can go and look up the Astartes videos on YouTube, about 40k. Those are so amazing, I think everyone would be just like, yeah, fine, put it in, it's great. He even got hired by the original company that were that good. But that doesn't mean that you let go of standards. That doesn't mean that just because an author wrote something in his spare time for his own enjoyment, that he let go of all standards for his own work. And it doesn't mean that Rings of Power just gets a free pass because Tolkien wrote a story about somebody else's characters once. Standards are important, and when somebody comes along and thinks that they can arrogantly just insert themselves into somebody else's world and change it and think that they can do better than the original author, the correct response to that is shame. How dare you do that? What gives you the right to do this, to go and crap on his work, to change his world? Why do you think that you are better than what he created? Why are you trying to change his universe for your ideology? How dare you? So coming out and going, well, technically, by the broadest definition, every single adaptation is fanfiction because it's not written by the original author, doesn't carry any weight. It's disingenuous, and it's not what anybody is saying at all. Your argument of semantics simply ignores what people actually mean when they use those words, and that is kind of important to language. And most of all, it removes all standards. It opens the floodgates to everything, and everything isn't good. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Like the video if you like the video, subscribe, more videos like this in the future, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.